All right. Good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. I hope everybody is doing great on this wonderful Tuesday morning. Oh my goodness, God is good all the time. And as they say all the time, God is good. We know that is a euphemism or a saying, but it is a true saying. So I want to say good morning to you all. I hope that everybody is doing great. Want to get some announcements out of the way. Keep in mind, this Friday we are having our giveaways, and I'm going to be doing trivia on things that have happened this year. So if you've been paying attention, if you've been living life this year, some of the things that the trivia will entail will be things that have happened over the year, this year only. So it's no trick questions for you to participate in our giveaways. And we have all kinds of things to give away this time. We've got some books. We've got some books on health. We've got DVD giveaway. We have some health products giveaway, beauty product giveaways. So it's going to be good on Friday. Also want to remind you that tonight I will be back here. I will be live streaming both Periscope and YouTube. So if you're having problems with the connection and you know my YouTube address, you can switch over to, excuse me, you can switch over to the YouTube live stream if you're having problems on Periscope. Tonight, I'm going to be sharing the word of the Lord for 2018. Again, my piece of the puzzle. I am but one prophet in the body of Christ, and I know that there are plenty more who God is speaking to concerning the coming year. So, if you want to hear my piece of the puzzle, I'll be on tonight at 8 p.m. I'll actually be on a call with another ministry, but I'm going to be live streaming for those of you all who are connected to us so that you can go back and hear the replay for tonight. So she is actually Apostle Marquita Stevenson, and she's going to be doing her broadcast by conference call, but I'm going to be live streaming it here for you all to be able to hear the ministry that goes forth and the word of the Lord for 2018. All right, so let us get started. I hope everybody has something to drink. I've been doing OJ lately for my morning drink, and organic OJ, nothing from concentrate. And we're getting back into our book on Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust. And we're in the chapter called Times of Trouble. We're actually about halfway through this book, so this is great because once we end this book, we're going to add another book, hopefully by the beginning of the new year. I want to say good morning to, who do we have down here? Lady Barbara, Lady Latoya, Lady Stephanie, Pastor Ben. Good morning to each of you. My sinuses only start acting up when I get on this broadcast, and when I end, everything is just fine. So I'm going to continue because we all know what this is. So let's keep going. We're also going to look at continuing our reading on the Black Bourgeoisie, which we started last week, which was written by E. Franklin Frazier. This is an excerpt from his book, The Black Bourgeoisie. And we started out talking about who they were, and we learned that the Black Bourgeoisie was of mixed ancestry. They were mixed blood aristocracy, and they had, the key was that they had to be those who were born free or who were freed before the Civil War. All right, so that is kind of what defined the Black bourgeoisie in the beginning. A lot of people now, because they have wealth, a lot of black people now, because they have wealth, have kind of classified themselves into the black bourgeoisie, but that's not really who the black bourgeoisie are, okay? So just because you are African American and you have attained enough wealth does not necessarily qualify you as being considered a part of the black bourgeoisie, okay? So let us continue with the times of trouble. We started looking at Christopher Columbus, and last week we talked about the fact that they enslaved Aboriginal Indians. According to Columbus's journals, they took those Aboriginal Indians across the seas. They taught them different languages, and then they brought them back over. Sometimes they brought them back over to the places where they had taken them, and sometimes they didn't, all right? So when people say, I know a lot of African American relatives would say, well, their relatives would say, we've already been here, or we've always been here. Some of you need to actually go back, especially if your grandparents and great-grandparents are still alive, and you need to start having some conversations with them about their origins and what they remember about their origins, and record it for yourself. All right. So if you're a person that is interested in your heritage and you're interested in looking into things, remember, the older we get, the less we tend to retain our information and remember things. So you want to be talking to your older relatives now, getting information from them, writing it down, creating a record so that you have that part of your history from your direct descendants, not from a DNA strip, because we talked about that last time, that some of these tests, okay, are fraudulent and they're not accurate. And yeah, so that is my recommendation. You want to talk to the older people in your family. I know in my family we have a few historians, my aunts and my uncles, who have been collecting our family history and been writing things down. And so I tend to reach out to them when I have questions about genealogy things, or who's related to us and how many cousins do we have and all of that good stuff. So make sure that you are gathering information about your own historical record from your direct descendants, especially your grandparents, great-grandparents, older aunts and uncles, etc. All right? So let's continue with our reading for today. The following comment is taken from a speech, "It's Time We Rethink Our History," by Dr. David Stidham at the first celebration of African American culture and history at Stratford High, Nashville, Tennessee, and published in a report March 1990. When we begin to rethink our history, we understand why history books were wrong. We were all miseducated. Columbus did not discover America. The historical facts: in December 1492, Columbus was totally lost, wandering around the Caribbean islands thinking he was in Asia, when he discovered by the native Arawak Americans who lived in these islands. He was discovered by them. Actually, it was the Arawak's ancestors who, 50,000 years before Columbus, discovered the Americas when they walked across the land bridging the Bering Strait. Columbus didn't discover anything. He was so confused and lost that he thought he was in India and called the Arawaks Indians. Christopher Columbus was considered a saint by the European who hailed his great so-called quote-unquote discovery. We need to rethink our history. Columbus was no saint, and the Arawak were not uncivilized savages. Like the African who came to America before and after Columbus, these were gentle people with a rich culture who worshiped the one creator. When we begin to rethink our history, we begin to put into historical perspective the true role of Europeans in our 500-year history. The prosperity, the wealth, the good European lifestyles we enjoy today in America began in 1492 and from its infant beginnings. This prosperity grew out of slavery. You see, slavery did not begin with importing African people to America. Slavery in America began with Columbus. The first slaves were not Africans, but Native Americans. Columbus wrote in his journals about the inhabitants of Haiti, present-day Haiti. All the inhabitants could be taken away to Castile or Spain or made slaves on the island. All right, so again, some of you and some of your ancestors have already been here. They were taken away from their islands, taken to Spain, or they were made slaves on other islands. With 50 men, he said, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want as long as we had our weapons. In truth, that is exactly what he did. Columbus enslaved the gentle Arawak Haitians, forced them to give up their gold and their land. After all, he had, quote unquote, discovered these riches. They were for his taking. What is also true is Columbus took hundreds of Arawak slaves to Spain, where they were sold or died. They didn't freely go with Columbus to meet the king, as my history books have led us to believe. In his quest for gold, Columbus had the hands cut off of any Arawak who did not bring in his or her quota of gold. In a short 40 years, the entire race of people in Haiti, 500,000 Native Americans, were wiped off the face of the earth by Columbus and the Spaniards that followed him. No, Columbus was no saint, and we need to rethink our history. Non-Europe people, especially Africans and the indigenous Americans of the Caribbean islands, referred to as Indians, initially attributed to the Europeans a humanity and a spirituality that they did not have, and still many do not have in their relationship with most of the non-European people of the world. This was a weakness in dealing with the aggressive Europeans, and to some extent it still is. Christopher Columbus was the forerunner of the European aggressor and land grabbers of today. They have justified this action in this regard in the name of their God, using the assumption that people were being brought under the influence of civilization. This indeed was a contradiction because the act committed against these people was uncivilized. When a people assume that their God approves of their criminal activities against other people, they have made God ungodly. And we're seeing that 2017. In many ways, the Europeans' misuse of religion has destroyed the spirituality that was initially the basis of all religion. The Carib and the Arawak Indians were curious about Christopher Columbus and his crew, and at first they treated them as strange and new guests in their homes. They did not know that soon after arrival, the guests would turn on the hosts and make them slaves. The destruction of the Caribs, which became the Caribbean people, and the Arawaks in the Caribbean islands through disease, rape of their women, and sometimes out-and-out murder, destroyed the labor supply on these islands and then made it a necessity for the Spaniards and other Europeans to create a rationale for the enslavement of the Africans. In his book, The Disruption of the Indies, Father de las Casas estimates that from 12 to 25 million indigenous Americans were killed on the islands in the Caribbean. The school books that indicate that Christopher Columbus was on a civilizing mission are a disservice to students and teachers who should be in rebellion against them. Christopher Columbus and his crew could have formed a successful partnership with the Indians that would have been to the benefit of both of them. While Columbus still prevails as a major hero to the Western world, sometime in the not too distant future, if African and Indian scholars who are descendants of those who were murdered start writing books about the opening up of the New World and start using new and old documents, especially the work of Bartolomeo de las Casas, Christopher Columbus will emerge as one of the great villains of human history, which indeed he was. When this revelation becomes apparent to most of the world, I think there will be a need for Columbus Day, but it will be a justifiable day of mourning for the millions of Africans and so-called Indians who died to accommodate the spread of European control over the Americas and Caribbean islands. Now, when he wrote this book, there was not a widespread rebellion against Columbus Day. So that actually has come to pass, that many people, some states, some cities are no longer celebrating Columbus Day. They're now call it Indigenous Day. So that actually came to pass. All right. Christopher Columbus had helped to set in motion the Atlantic slave trade, the greatest single Holocaust in human history. Most modern day scholars who have a one-dimensional view of history, mostly partial to Europe, are not ready to consider the fact of the pre-Columbian presence of several different nationalities before Columbus, going back as far as 1000 BC. Professor Ivan Van Sertima's book, They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in Ancient America, is clear on this subject, which we actually read from in season 1 of Daring Dialogues. The Vikings came in a hurry and obviously left in a hurry. They left little evidence of their culture or their art and no evidence of their literature. This must have been a culture in transition. The pre-Columbian presence of Orientals in the New World has been alluded to and partly documented in a number of books, such as Ancient Egyptians and Chinese in America by R.A. Jarasboui, and Columbus Was Chinese, Discoveries and Inventions of the Far East by Hans Brewer. This early meeting of the Africans, the Orientals, and the Indians was a complementary infusion of culture that today could be a lesson for the whole world, because in all that we have learned in documents, there was not a hint of war between these cultures and people. This brings us to a conclusion. Yes, exactly. And it was not the worst. It was bad, but it was not the worst. This brings us to a conclusion that might be difficult for a lot of people to accept. Maybe the world outside of Europe didn't need Europeans in the first place. Maybe in this fakery about spreading civilization, Columbus actually destroyed more civilizations than he ever built and did the world more harm than good. What I learned from reading the literature on this subject is that this early meeting between indigenous Americans, Orientals, and Africans was a laboratory in human relationships, because it proved that people of different cultures and religions and colors, hues, melanated skin tones, however you want to say it, can coexist. They can complement each other without dominating or attempting to destroy one another. We find the personality of Christopher Columbus and his associates constantly recurring in the early part of this drama about the opening up of what is referred to as the New World. Little emphasis is placed on the fact that Christopher Columbus wasn't too clear about where he was, and he knew nothing about the people he met in the lands he allegedly discovered. Instead of being a meeting of cultures and an amalgam of cultures complementing each other by infusion, Christopher Columbus set in motion a tragic clash of culture that has not ended until this day. This clash of cultures is caused by the arrogant assumption on the part of some Europeans that they are the only people who ever produce anything worthy of being called a culture. And we see this again even to this day. When you dismiss other people's culture, that's called arrogance. When you think that your culture, because it's currently dominant in society, is the only right culture or the only way of doing things, that's called arrogance. And then when we look at what you call culture and people begin to realize that you've stolen it from about 20 other different cultures, that's called thievery. So then you have to say, what is it exactly that you initially invented? All right. There's a funny meme that's going around that says the Europeans invented racism. It's the one thing they invented that they don't want to take credit for. They invented racism. In other words, dividing people across social and economic lines because of the hue of their skin, or what W.E.B. Du Bois called the color line. They invented the color line, but they don't want to take credit for it. Or when people call them to the carpet on this thing they invented, they say, oh, it's not in existence anymore, when clearly it's in existence. All right. The following entry in Christopher Columbus's diary is taken from Documents of West Indian History, Volume 1, 1492 through 1655, from the Spanish discovery to the British conquest of Jamaica, edited by Eric Williams. This is taken from Columbus's diary. All right. Tuesday, 15th of January, the intercourse at Caribe would, however, be difficult because the natives are said to eat human flesh. The admiral determined to go there as it was en route and thence to Matanino, which was said to be entirely peopled by women without men. He would thus see both islands and might take some of the natives. In his entry of 15th of January, Columbus infers that some of the people of Carib, also known as Puerto Rico, are cannibals. This is one of the most persistent myths, coming mainly from Europeans, using it as a rationale to reduce some non-European people to servitude. This charge is often made and rarely proven. Ironically, the charge of cannibalism is more often charged to a people who in their society have more than an adequate supply of non-human meat, thus making the charge generally come from a society that has been historically short of non-human meat. From this deduction, I leave it to the individual reader to arrive at his or her own conclusion. Many people, this is not in a lot of history books, but many people don't realize that the early settlers to the Americas, they became so hungry and they did not know how to plant food that they became cannibals and started eating each other. This is not in most history books. So who was the cannibals? The early settlers to the Americas, unless the Indians at that point had stepped in and showed them how to plant things like corn, they were starving to death and they started eating each other at Jamestown. But in order to justify slavery, Columbus wrote a report saying, oh, these people are cannibals. That's why we're enslaving them. Lies, lies, lies. Here's another one from his journal. Monday, 18th of February. He pretended to have gone over more ground to mislead the pilots and Marines who pricked off the charts in order that he might remain master of the route to the Indies, as in fact he did. For none of the others kept an accurate reckoning, so that no one but himself could be sure of the route to the Indians. In his entry of 18th of February, there's a clear indication of deception between Christopher Columbus and his pilots. If he originally set out to go to the East Indies, why did he go to the West Indies? This is why the indigenous people, the Caribs and the Arawaks, are referred to as Indians. This aspect of the Columbus saga needs investigation over and beyond the hero worship of Christopher Columbus and those who have written a library of books about this individual who we still do not know fully. In chapter 2 of his book, The Columbus Conspiracy, Michael Bradley goes beyond the personality of Columbus and deals with the possibility that there were previous explorers in the Americas, such as the Carthaginians and the Phoenicians. In this speculation, Michael Bradley is not only telling us more things that we need to know, he's also telling us that about human curiosity in relationship to exploration. Michael Bradley alludes to the late development of the nation state in Europe and the still slower development of a uniform language and culture that Europeans could understand one to the other. Today, this would seem like a contradiction, because in most textbooks and in mass media, the European is presented to the world as though he arrived culturally pure and endowed with the knowledge and mandate to lead the whole world, when in fact, most of what the Europeans knew was taken from other cultures. What Michael Bradley has said in this chapter is that Europeans, like all other people in the world, had to endure a long and hard struggle before arriving at a state in a condition that could justify what is being called civilization. Europeans lack an understanding of most of the peoples of the world, mainly because they had lacked an understanding of themselves. In a previous chapter of his book, he takes up a more dangerous issue. This issue deals with the possible Jewish input into the New World discovery and the medieval roots of internal religious conflicts in Europe, affecting a segment of the Jewish population who might have disguised themselves as Catholics. He alludes to some misconceptions we might still have about the person of Jesus the Christ, his early life, and his relationship to the Jewish people of biblical times. This chapter has both topical and historical roots, putting on the agenda for discussion some of the little-known aspects of the Christian history and its relationship to the role of Jewish people in world history. This chapter, carefully read, might start debates, fistfights, and in some places it might also cause this author to seek a hiding place. Mr. Bradley alludes to the assumption that the royal house of France could have been Jewish and that the Jewish bloodline came into Europe in this manner. This information, while generally unknown, has been known and debated amongst a select group of scholars for the past 40 years. I am of the opinion that these scholars think people beyond their academic circle are not intelligent enough to understand the truth about history. So, Bradley dared put some of the forbidden subjects on the agenda. He has rendered a service that he will not be universally thanked for, but it is a service nonetheless. After reading this chapter, I strongly suggest the reading of two very neglected works by Professor Alvin Kuhn. One is, Who is This King of Glory? In my opinion, it's one of the clearest books written on the Christ, and The Shadow of Third Century, another book written about the early rise of Christianity. He concludes this chapter with the statement, Columbus seems to have been born of a heretical family. The points that I've been alluding to are summarized at the close of chapter 3. It says this, Godefroy de Bouillon wanted to create a new Jerusalem in the Holy Land, where the three great faiths of the West could be reconciled. He failed, but this sort of crusade is what apparently motivated Columbus and his supporters and financial backers. His voyage may have been a crusade to establish a new Jerusalem in a new world. And I think this is the light in which we should view his motivations. It is also a perspective and a light that will permit some insight into the unlikely coincidences of his life. He seems to have been part of an ancient noble conspiracy to create a world of religious toleration between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, a new Jerusalem. That, I think, was Columbus's concept of a crusade and the only worthwhile kind of crusade. Now, let's just pause there and let's think about what just happened end of last week and what number 45 just did, what he announced, and how people reacted, and how the Pope had to come back and restore some semblance of calm to some of the people, right? Because number 45 did what he was supposed to do in the office that he is holding, and he pronounced Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, right? And then 3 people had to come behind him and say, hold up. This is going to anger a lot of people. Why? because at this point, there are three faiths that consider that to be their holy city: the Christian, the Jew, and the Muslim. So this thing that Christopher Columbus was involved in many, many hundreds of years ago now was about taking the concept of the New Jerusalem and trying to find a new world to establish a New Jerusalem. So when people say New World Order, they have to understand how far back that term actually goes and what does it actually mean and what are they actually talking about. All right. Attempts to unravel the Columbus mystery was not left to only a few scholars. There have been long debates and some serious questions raised in academic circles without any public attention being raised. African American scholars such as J.A. Rogers, Carter G. Woodson, and William Hansberry have raised this question in their works. In an essay, The Origins of Racism in the Americas, by the Caribbean writer Jan Carew, in the book African Themes, Northwestern University Studies, he infers that the Columbus exploration to the New World was the possible origin of present-day racism. His statement is as follows: "It is extraordinary that in the 482 years since the Arawakian of San Salvador discovered Columbus and his sailors on their beaches, so little research has been done on the origins of racism in the New World. This paucity of research is all the more astonishing when one considers that patterns of race relations and systems of caste, that means your social position, color, and class have not changed a great deal in 4 3/4 centuries since the Columbian era. But before examining the subject of racism in the New World, we should consider briefly two important early visits to the New World. Number 1, 5 centuries before Columbus, the Norsemen sailed to Greenland, Labrador, and points south of the St. Lawrence estuary. And 2, in pre-Columbian times, Africans also visited the Americas. The most notable expedition taking place, Arab chronicles tell us, in 1310, when the Emperor of Mali determined to extend his empire beyond the western reaches of its Atlantic shores. This is also detailed in Ivan Van Sertima's book, They Came Before Columbus. All right, so Africans came to the Americas before Columbus. He sailed with 400 ships to the New World. This is recorded in their documents. The shadowy precursors of both Columbus and the African slave had a distinct bearing on subsequent events and played a significant role in laying the foundations of a new civilization in the Americas. In chapter 5 of his book, Michael Bradley maintains that there could have been 2 Columbuses, one being a master pirate of French descent, the other possibly being Christopher Columbus of history. He points to the documents that made him arrive at this conclusion and the circumstances that tend to prove that the truth of his conclusion is at least a possibility. He again alludes to the possible Jewish origins of Christopher Columbus and that the purpose of his voyage had a mission extending beyond discovery and search for gold. Many people today believe that Columbus was a Sephardic Jew, that he was a Spanish Jew, okay? He points to evidence that tends to indicate that there was a religious meaning behind the voyage that is rooted in some of the conflicts and mysteries around the origin of Christianity. Michael Bradley has put on the agenda a subject that might start another crusade. To fully understand his book, it might be necessary to go away from the massive information in the book and look at the period in European history from 1400 to 1600. And I actually have some books specifically on that period because it's pretty much not really mentioned in most history books. You actually have to go and dig for books that are specifically on that time period to find out what was happening in Europe at the time. So I may pull that out next Tuesday and talk a little bit about what was happening in Europe between 1400 and 1600. After the Crusades and the period of plagues and famines, all right, this is what was going on in Europe. Plagues and famine. Plagues and famine. In other words, there was a reason why the Europeans were pushing out of Europe to go to other places. Disease and hunger. All right? They don't like to talk about that period of their time. After the Crusades and the period of plagues and famines, Europe had lost 1/3 of its population. The Africans and the Arabs, who had been controlling Spain in the Mediterranean since the year 711, were still in control, though that control had begun to weaken. Europeans were short of food and the ability to preserve their food. They wanted and needed access to spices and sweets and preservatives of Asia in order to continue to survive. And to this day, it has still been about who's going to survive. This is the period when some of the conflict between the various factions of the Catholic Church was settled by the marriage of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain. It was also the period when Spain regained her sovereignty and drove out her Arab and African colonial masters, collectively called the Moors. The Spanish were looking for ethnic and religious purity, and therefore they began to expel the Jews along with the Arabs and the Africans of Muslim faith. This was not only a turning point in the history of Europe, it was a major turning point in the history of the world. This period not only saw the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, the European colonization of most of the world, the Europeans subsequently began to colonize information about the history of the world. They colonized images. What do they mean by they colonized images? In other words, they began to whitewash the images of people that already existed during that time. So many of the images that you see today, all right, they were whitewashed images. They were images that were constructed to create a white Europe that at the time was not white. So how do I know this is factual? Number one, because my degree is in art history, and art education. So we got a chance to see some of the images before whitewashing. And so when you look at these images of some of these kings and queens, they were painted white, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were white. You know, much like what's his name? Bobby Jindal, the former governor, I think, of Louisiana. Okay, Bobby Jindal is darker than me, but his presidential picture was painted to make him look like a white man. And people were like, why is he doing that? Because that's the way he wants to be remembered in history. All right. So not only did they colonize information, not only did they take information and destroy sources and then say it belonged to them, but they also colonized the imagery of the people living during that time. They began to infer that whiteness was the image of God and goodness. These are things today that my fellow white Americans don't want to admit to. They don't want to talk about this. When you ask them, why are they worshiping a white Jesus? Why are they worshiping a Jesus that looks like Kenny Loggins? The first thing they're going to tell you is, it doesn't matter what color he was. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. It does matter. It matters because it's a lie. And you should want the truth in all things, as you claim to say you do want. All right? So there was a period, a historical period of time where they were whitewashing the images. In other words, they were erasing blackness. All right? So when people get on this subject and they're talking about what is happening to black culture now, and they're telling you that they're whitewashing black culture now, all right? When they're telling you they're whitewashing R&B, in the next 20 years, you're not even probably going to know that black people were singing R&B because it's being whitewashed by who they're choosing to lead the movement. Okay, that's just a microcosm of what was happening in the New World. So they began to infer that whiteness and the image was the image of goodness and God. The most tragic aspect of their colonization of image was their colonization of the image of God and the people of the book, or the people of the scriptures. This is the period when the Europeans began to infer that the world was waiting in darkness for Europeans to bring the light. So when you ask, where does the origins of white supremacist thought come from? It comes from this lie. That had it not been for Europeans bringing the light to the world, then civilization as we know it would not exist, when it's simply not true. There were plenty of civilizations there that existed. There were kings, there were queens, there were universities, there were libraries, and I could go on and on and on. There was mathematics, there was science. But that was whitewashed, because there had to be a whitewashing of history in order for them to be able to go around the world ravaging people of other cultures. Okay? Totally aside from opening up the Caribbean islands, North and South America for European exploration, Christopher Columbus had set in motion the rationale for the destruction of other indigenous populations that he mistakenly referred to as Indians. He had stimulated the Atlantic slave trade. The Africans were used as a rationale to replace the rapidly disappearing Indian. But the rapidly disappearing Indian was not just disappearing, he was being murdered off by Columbus and his thugs. They were Neanderthugging. All right. So that was chapter 7. Chapter 8 is called The Forced Migration. So we'll take a look at that next week. All right. Let's travel up the time continuum back up to the 1900s, and let's look at the black bourgeoisie. All right. The Black Bourgeoisie, the actual book itself, is by E. Franklin Frazier. All right. And it was first published in 1955 and then finally made its way over to publication in the United States in 1957. He started out, we left off by him saying that the black bourgeoisie rejected their own people. They rejected the description of the masses of Negroes, or the masses of black people, but they were also rejected by white society. So they're kind of in the middle, not necessarily because they had to be, but in one aspect they actually chose to be, because they were the ones rejecting black people, the mass of black people, and they desperately wanted to assimilate into white society, but white society for the most part was rejecting them, as we talked about. And then again, we talked about now how white society is beginning to receive them, okay? Because white society still has a population growth problem now, and it's gotten worse, all right? So because it has gotten worse, okay, we're now at the place in human existence where many people are fearful of their extinction. Not just their physical extinction, but they're afraid of the extinction of their way of life. Some of you may have seen the recent interview about the election that is happening today, and I hope Alabamians go out and vote. They actually have two different races to vote in, so I hope they will go out and vote and take as many pieces of identification as they need to so that they don't get railroaded at the voting polls and suppressed in their ability to vote. I'm talking to you, Black Alabamians, right now. I hope you will go and vote today, and that you will vote moral conscience. And moral conscience might tell you not to be voting for someone who's a suspected pedophile or child molester. But that's a whole other story. All right. So at this point in human history, there is a fear of extinction of people's way of life. And there was an interview that was put out on social media, and they were interviewing all of these voters who I believe were all Republican and they were all Christian. And they said some very, very important and key things that I hope people were paying attention to when they were talking. And one lady at the end of the video, she said, policy is everything. That's what she said. Policy is everything. If we do not elect somebody in who implements the policies that basically help us to survive or help us to stay on top, it's all over. It's over. And so this whole thing here about the black bourgeoisie now being accepted into white society is a part of that same conversation, that in order to survive, in order to keep a people group going, right? We talked about the ratio of replacement, that for every family within a people group, on average, you're supposed to be reproducing 2.5 kids. In other words, 2 kids and 1 in the belly, in order for your particular ethnic group to continue to survive another generation. And right now, the extinction rate for African Americans, we're at extinction rate, and so are white Americans at extinction rate. I think the only people right now who aren't at extinction rate are the Latino, all right? And as we know, there's been lots of conversation about the blackening and the browning of America, right? And so I don't know if many of you have realized this, but when the census comes around and they're trying to take note of populations and who's who, some of the Latino community is now being grouped into the statistics for white America. They're labeling them as white so they can boost their numbers to say we're still the majority in the country. But if you actually break down the numbers, you'll realize they are losing their majority in the country. And because they know this, right, it now becomes more imperative to accept people who can pass for white. All right. And that's what was happening in the early 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. There were black people who were light enough to pass for white. And so there's been a couple of documentaries on people who actually left their families, had no further connection with their families because they were deciding that they were going to pass for white and live as a white person in society. And so that was something that was common, that began to happen. People began to leave their black families because they were light enough to pass for white, and they continued living their life as a white person. All right. So let's talk here about what he calls the mark of oppression. The mark of oppression for the black bourgeoisie. There is an attempt on the part of the parents in middle-class families to shield their children against racial discrimination and the contempt of whites for colored people. Now, is this still happening today? Is there an attempt of black people in the middle class to shield their children against racial discrimination and the anger that whites have for people of color? Absolutely. So that policy is still, that concept is still in effect. Then he says, sometimes the parents go to fantastic extremes, such as prohibiting the use of the words Negro or colored in the presence of their children. They sometimes try to prevent their children from knowing that they cannot. They've even grouped black Egyptians as white. Correct. Yes, they have. They sometimes try to prevent their children from knowing that they cannot enter restaurants or other public places because they are Negroes, or even that the schools they attend are segregated schools for Negroes. Despite such efforts to insulate their children against a hostile white world, the children of the black bourgeoisie cannot escape the mark of oppression. This is strikingly revealed in the statement of a 17-year-old middle-class Negro youth. When asked if he felt inferior in the presence of white people, he gave the following answer, which was somewhat unusual for its frankness, but typical of the attitude of the black bourgeoisie. So let's see what this teenager had to say. He said, offhand, I'd say no, but actually knowing all these things that are thrown up to you about white people being superior, that they look more or less down upon all Negroes, that we have to look to them for everything that we get, that they'd rather think of us as mice than men, I don't believe I or any other Negro can help but feel inferior. My father says that it isn't so, that we only feel inferior to those whom we feel are superior. But I don't believe that we could feel otherwise. Around white people, until I know them a while, I feel out of place. Once I played a ping pong match with a white boy whose play I know wasn't as good as mine, and boys he managed to beat with ease, but I just couldn't get it out of my mind that I was playing a white boy, sort of an Indian sign on me, you know. The statement of this youth reveals how deep-seated is the feeling of inferiority, from which even the most favored elements among the blacks cannot escape. However much some middle-class Negroes may seek to soothe their feeling of inferiority in an attitude which they often express, it is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, they are still conscious of their inferior status in American society. They may say, as did the bewildered middle-class youth, that they are proud of being a Negro or proud of being a member of the upper stratum of the community and feel sorry for the Negro masses stuck in the mud. But they often confess, as did the youth. He goes on to say, however, knowing that there are difficulties that confront us all as Negroes, if I could be born again and had my choice, I'd really want to be born a white boy. I mean white or my same color, providing I could occupy the same racial and economic level I now enjoy. I am glad I am this color. I'm frequently taken for a foreigner. I wouldn't care to be lighter or darker and be a Negro. I am the darkest one in the family due to my constant outdoor activities. I realize, of course, that there are places where I can't go despite my family or money just because I happen to be a Negro. With my present education, family background, and so forth, if I was only white, I could go places in life. A white face holds supreme over a black one despite its economic and social status. Frankly, it leaves me confused. Listen, if you are a black person wishing that you could be born white, get some help. That's the simplest way I could say it. Not all middle-class Negroes consciously desire as this youth to be white in order to escape from their feelings of inferiority. In fact, the majority of middle-class Negroes would deny having the desire to be white, since this would be an admission of their feelings of inferiority. Within an intimate circle of friends of some middle-class Negroes may admit that they desire to be white, but publicly they would deny any such wish. The black bourgeoisie constantly boast of their pride in their identification as Negroes, but when one studies the attitude of this class in regards to the physical traits or social characteristics of black people, it becomes clear that the black bourgeoisie do not really wish to be identified with Negroes. So what is he saying? He's saying that no matter how light you appear, and no matter how mixed race your ancestry is, you cannot escape this quote unquote mark of oppression that has been put on anyone of Negro descent or black descent. Regardless of how your skin color looks, there's still going to be some people in society who disparage you because of you having Negro in you. Lady Stephanie says you will always be seen as black. All right. And we saw that with, what's the girl name? Meghan Markle. Clearly. All right. She's 1/8. They would have called her octoroon back in the day. She's 1/8 African descent. But most of the commentators about her engagement, okay, to Prince Harry, most of the commentators focused on that 1/8 of her. And there are some commentators still saying that they don't think she's going to do well in the royal family because of that 1/8. It causes exclusion. All right. So next week, we're going to talk about the insecurities and frustrations of the black bourgeoisie. And we're going to stop here for today, since I'm not past time. But I hope that you got something out of the readings today. Again, I want to encourage you, if you're able to join tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I will be sharing the word of the Lord here. And God has really given me some very specific things of what's going to happen in 2018 and some stances that he wants the believers to take. So if you're able to come back and join us at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I encourage you to do so. I hope that you will personally do some more study on Christopher Columbus, on Europe between 1400 and 1600, what was going on in Europe, what really was forcing them out and pushing them out to go explore other people's lands, that you would do that research for yourself. So it's not just me telling you, but it's you actually finding out as well so that we can converse together. All right. And I will have a book on that next week for you guys to take a look at. All right. I want to say thank you today for your time and attention. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness. So please go out and be light on today. Take care, and I hope to see you tonight at 8 p.m. And God bless.